Thank you, everyone, for being here. It is just about noon, and so we'll wait for the clock to turn noon. But thank you, everyone, for joining us on today's webinar about effective communications on the farm. There's two of us presenting today, and we'll introduce ourselves in a little bit. But I want to start out with if you have questions or if you have any comments, go ahead. We're using both the Q&A and the chat features today in today's webinar. So you can go ahead and communicate with us that way, and we'll get started. So thank you for being here. And I want to start out today's webinar with a question. What if I told you that the way we think naturally, the way we communicate, could be having an effect on our profitability and our performance of our business? It could range from a 30% effect to even up to a 200% effect is what research shows. It could be in the way of wasted time or wasted money, even wasted resources. It could be in the way of having to do something a second time when the first time didn't work out. Or maybe it's an impact on relationships. All of these things can be effects from communication or lack thereof. So we're going to talk today about some of the reasons for ways we communicate and some tips on how to communicate better. So communication. We have communication with all kinds of people throughout the day on a farm. I mean, it could be our colleagues working with us day to day. A lot of times these are family members, but they might not be. It could be vendors. It could be people that we really care about relationship-wise. It could be people that are bringing things to us or people who are shipping things off the farm. So there's lots of ways that we communicate on a farm. I'll introduce myself first. I'm Suzanne Henricks. I work with the University of Minnesota Agricultural Business Management team. We're a small but mighty team across the state, and we're regional educators who focus on topics like taxes for business or record keeping and different reports that you can run, maybe farm bill updates. We also focus on women in ag, which is what we're having this webinar for today. And we also talk a lot about farm transition. And that's something that's really been a topic of interest recently. A lot of people are going through farm transitions. So there's my email address, and I'll have it on later on in the webinar as well. And my co-presenter is Eliza Carlson. She'll introduce herself here in a few minutes, but she is a graduate student at South Dakota State University. She's focusing her master's work on needs of women in agriculture. So we teamed up to offer this webinar series today, or this webinar today. So let me get back to talking about the external factors and intrinsic ways that we communicate together. And the first one is that a lot of times farming has been a family business. It continues to be a family business. That is such a blessing that we get to work with our family members. Sometimes that's really hard. It could be that you farm, maybe you farm with your dad, and you cannot get over the fact that you sit at the same table that you used to sit at when you were 5 years old. And your dad sits in the same spot, you sit in the same spot. When you come in for lunch, you might be discussing some important details. And it's hard to get over the fact that he is your dad, but yet he is your business partner as well. So we're going to give some tips on how to work through that. We know too that a lot of times farms need to not only work with family, but they need to hire outside staff to get the work done. So this graph that's from the Pew Research Center, they did a research study in February of 2023, asking workers what they really value about their job. What are some aspects that are important to them and their job satisfaction? So we know that in this study, many people said relationships with coworkers is a big deal for them at work. That's an important part of getting along with people. Communication involves relationships. We know that the second most high satisfaction piece is that relationship with managers and supervisors is a very important part of getting along at work and having satisfaction with your workplace. So all of those pieces involve communications. We have another graph from the Pew Research study that they conducted in February 2023 about extremely satisfied or extremely not satisfied, and knowing that relationships was a focus, so they dove deeper into that topic. And what about relationships is a satisfying piece of working? And you can see here on this graph that there are many parts that are important to satisfaction at work. Many of those things involve relationships with other people and that satisfaction. So we wanted you to have some information about how satisfaction at the job place is an important piece. And that's no different on a farm. We know that this survey was of workers who responded to their job satisfaction survey request. But we know that job satisfaction is important at farms because it is really hard to find people to work nowadays, and communication is a big part of that. There's also a shift happening in just the industrialization of work in general. We know that in the 1700s, a lot of work was done with horse and buggy. And you can see that changed over time into the 1800s, where there was more mechanization, became steam power, things like that. We know that the Industrial Revolution up to like the 1960s really made shifts happen in how people worked. All along, you can see on the continuum on the bottom that there has been a human resources evolution as well. So making sure that leaders on farms and managers on farms need to communicate well in order to keep up with these times. We know that nowadays, technology has really taken over and the workplace is much smaller. There's more specialization. So keeping the employees that we have and working well with them is also an important piece. So I alluded to this piece where we know that farms, it's a family business most times. There's that system of family, and there's also the business system. And this diagram shows that there is that sweet spot where you get to work with your family. It's such a blessing, and we know that that's an important piece of working together. But there's also shifts in dynamics as we go, and making sure that we're working on your goals is an important part of this, and being able to focus together and communicate well in order to achieve our goals. So that's something that Eliza's going to hit on as we get into the tips and tricks. So a few things about how we are as people in this. I wanted to share the generational differences. So as we look at the different generations that can be in the workplace today, we know that generational differences can affect us. Some people like to work differently. Some people like to communicate differently. We all communicate differently. So generations make a difference. So if we look at the Generation Z, which is the youngest generation in the workplace today, these people are usually teens to young adults. There's, of course, different time periods that if you look at different research, but I'm going to use the time period of 1997 to 2012. Those folks are born and called Generation Z. They've never known a world without the internet. They're usually really tech savvy. So in the workplace, these people are great to put in charge of websites or social media. They also appreciate very regular feedback, check-ins quite a few times a week, maybe just 5-minute check-ins. So as you think about managing a farm and thinking about communications, this group appreciates very regular and quick feedback. They also value time away from their jobs. So they like to work when they're at work, and then they like to have time off. The next group that we like to focus on is the millennial group, usually considered to be born around 1981 to 1996. They're in their 20s and 30s at this time. They have surpassed all the other generations, and they now make up 35% of the workforce. They are the largest group working in the workforce nowadays. They grew up with technology. They grew up as technology was coming of age, and social media too. Millennials often are less formal. They're open to feedback and open to discussions. And they really like as well frequent feedback in a structured way. So they appreciate having check-ins. Maybe they don't need weekly or even daily check-ins, but they do appreciate check-ins on a regular basis. And they too appreciate time and flexibility, time off away from the job. We know that Generation X is considered usually to be born between 1965 to 1980. So they're in their 40s and 50s. And they grew up in a time that was coined the latchkey kids, because a lot of their mothers worked outside of the home, and they would come home and be responsible for themselves between that after school time until parents got home for supper. So they are self-reliant. They're hardworking. They're not intimidated by authority, and they like to have candid communication. So they appreciate knowing updates, or they appreciate someone saying, you know what, I noticed that we're working on it this way. I'd really like it to happen that way. They want to have that clear communication and candid feedback right away. So they value constructive feedback, but not excessive, and they don't need a lot of oversight as well. Then we have the baby boomers. They're usually considered to be born between 1946 to 1964, so they're in their 60s and 70s. A lot of times they grew up with mothers at home. They were influenced by the Vietnam War and civil rights reform, and they're dedicated to work. A lot of times, baby boomers are considered to be workaholics, or described as workaholics. They tend to be ambitious and driven. They do respect authority, but they don't always trust authority is what they tend to do. They value recognition. So instead of feedback, baby boomers do appreciate recognition, a title or acknowledgement of a good job, a job well done. So that's something about baby boomers. And then we know that we do have the silent generation in the workforce as well, especially on farms, because a lot of times they're that ownership generation. They might be owning the land or the farm that's happening with all the farming activity on it. So they're born from 1928 to 1945, and they tend to be that over 70 group. So they're what we've coined as the traditional group of American values of hard work, loyalty, respect for authority, and conformity. They a lot of times value having a structured workplace, and then employees conform to that structure or whatever the culture is at that workplace. They're concerned about the business. They want it to succeed. And of course, on a farm, they're concerned about their legacy. So that's something that is important to them. And they require infrequent feedback. So if there is a younger generation giving direction to a silent generation, they don't require a lot of feedback. They just need to know what's expected. And no news is good news in their eyes. So that's one way that we can look at how we communicate when we have been born, our generations. We know that gender can make a big difference too. We know that sometimes men tend to want to solve a problem. They might want to listen and then get right to the work. Women sometimes talk about something in order to make sense of it. Thinking and talking is something that women tend to do more of. I have a little video here that explains it. So I would ask Eliza, if you cannot hear it when I started, would you please let me know? So this will kind of exemplify how men and women tend to, and not always is this the case. There's been a lot of research on gender differences and communication. Not everyone fits in these stereotypical norms, but there are some typical or things that people tend to do. So I'll go ahead and start this video.
It's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me, and I can just feel it, like literally feel it. in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
See, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See, you're
out.
not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just, sometimes it's like there's this achy, I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
That sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. Ow. If you would just...
Don't.
Try to see things.
So that's put together by our friends at, oh my goodness, let me get out of here now. Let's see if I can. There we go. Okay, that's put together by our friends at University of Wisconsin Extension about communication and gender differences. So that's something that I just wanted to highlight for you. I think it explains how men and women tend to communicate differently about things. And then we also know that personality style makes a difference too. There are lots of personality style assessments, such as Clifton Strengths, or maybe Myers-Briggs, different types that are out there right now. And I think that you can gain a lot of knowledge from those types of assessments, and personality styles do make a difference. That flows into communication styles. It could be that you work with someone on your farm that needs more time to think about something, maybe mull something over before they make a decision. So then that would give you strategy to say, okay, I'm going to give them a week, if you have that luxury, to think about this. Sometimes you need to make a decision right away and you don't have that time period, but communication styles are different. Some people can make decisions right on the spot. Some people like to think about things. So all of those things play into how we communicate, or maybe how we don't communicate well together. Communication preferences, all these things that I've just talked about, our generations, our gender differences, our personality styles, they are all ways that we prefer to communicate, but a lot of times we do lean into other ways of communicating as well. So that just means that's how we prefer to communicate. And of course, this is a fruit bowl. Sometimes it's basket upset. We do want to make sure that we're connecting and talking with each other, apples to apples, oranges to oranges. So Eliza is going to give us some tips on how to do that better. So I'll take down my screen. But first I want to give you, this is my contact information. I'm located at the Brainerd Regional Extension Office, and that's my phone number and my contact information. I'll stop sharing my screen and then I'll pass it over to Eliza to start sharing hers.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Suzanne. All right, awesome. So thank you all again for being here today. We're really appreciative of it. And so as I was figuring out what exactly I wanted to study, and after conversations with Suzanne, and then the survey I presented at the Women in Ag conference in February, we realized of just various tips to give women in agriculture, specifically about just ways to improve their communication, but specifically their communication when it comes to maybe either times of conflict. And I'm going to get into 3 different areas of what that looks like, and then a few sample activities you could also in place in your lifetime, right, to help with these the tips that I'll mention here in a little bit. And then after I'm done, we'll have the Q&A. So kind of going into what I'll be talking about today. And so 3 different areas, like I talked about just a second ago. First is those communication struggles you may have with yourself. And so what would be some tips or some things to look out for? And so before you can even think about, trying to solve something with a family member or spouse, or, looking at those different communication styles, well, you have to first look within yourself. And then the second one, we'll be talking about communication with, spouses, significant others. And then lastly, the third one, about, with different family members and generationally, those types of things, and then just some takeaways. And so what I want first for us to do is think about what is one area of communication that you struggle with. And so I did enable the chat. And so I would like for you to think on it for a second here and then put something in the chat of one area of communication you struggle with. This can be anything, whether it's, interpersonal things, maybe it's that clear communication, maybe it's specific terminology of, equipment terminology between yourself and a family member. Or maybe it's really articulating your expertise to your family members, whatever it might be. And so I want you to utilize the chat right now to answer what is one area of communication that you struggle with. And then I might read a couple. It's okay if you don't have one. Okay, so I'm reading a couple here, focusing on listening and really hearing the person I'm talking with. So thinking about maybe struggling with active listening and really being present can be a good one. Expressing to husband, that is not my area of expertise. Okay. Any others that people want to share? Give me a second, I'll move on to the rest of my stuff. Perfect. So as you kind of put more of those in the chat, I just want you to kind of think about it, right? As I go through the rest of my presentation here today of what is that, one or multiple areas that you're struggling with. And as you learn from some of the tips I present today of, well, maybe what are some ways that you can remedy that, right? Or to continue to grow in those areas and to show others, and especially women in ag, how you can, grow in your communication abilities. And so I wanted to include this slide here next, just because of why I think this topic is important, but also why it matters, why I'm going to be talking about it today. To listen. And so the biggest thing, right, is thinking about with women in agriculture is that we are making strides, and that we are empowering the next generation of leaders in agriculturists, whether that's women or men or whoever, right? And so thinking about that, they have the means to be powerful and successful, and we have to continue to give them those tools and those tactics to be successful. And so as I was looking through my survey and listening to the needs of women in agriculture, thinking about those communication struggles and those interpersonal relationships they have and how to overcome those things, but also to continue to recognize those things and grow. And so that's why I really wanted to talk about this today, is just because of the impact, right, that women in agriculture have, but also that to continue to see how important communication is and how it can lead to so many successful moments within your family and within your relationships, but also within your farm and within your business and in your workplace, whatever it might be. And so the first thing I wanted to talk about today is looking at those communication characteristics within yourself. And so I'm going to go over a few tips and things to look out for here, and then an activity to follow for you to take note of. And so thinking about, again, recognizing those communication characteristics in yourself. What you need to do first is to recognize who you are as a communicator before you're able to look at other communication elements with other people, with other family members. And so first thing is knowing what your strengths are. And so this can be of just utilizing what you are best at and what your strengths are can really implement this, because if you know what your strengths are and you bring them to the table, then you can articulate that to others, and they can then know, okay, this is what this person is really strong in, or this is what this person isn't as strong in and that they need to grow in. And so if you're knowledgeable about what your strengths are, then it'll be much easier for those conversations, those communications down the line. An example is, I'll talk about this for an activity, is maybe you're taking some sort of, strengths finder test. Maybe you're, really thinking about it individually of, what are your strengths? Maybe you're more of an activator. And so maybe you really like to make sure that something is getting done, and that you're able to, accomplish it, and recognizing if you know that, then really showcasing that as well. And so utilizing those to your advantage. Maybe you're a futuristic person, right? And so if knowing that that is a strength of yours, is that you're futuristic, then making sure you're articulating that to those around you and recognizing that that's your own strength that you can really utilize and as well, and just clarify that. The second one is asking yourself, what are areas of communication that you want to improve? And so taking the time to really think about those areas of improvement, recognizing your own growth will lead others that are more inclined to think about their growth as well. And so if you jump right into something and don't first ask yourself, well, what are the areas that I also need to improve upon, then it might make that process a little more rocky. And so if you're first analyzing for yourself, what are some areas that you want to improve upon, then it will make that process a little bit more easier as you start communicating with others as well. Another one is being open to feedback and willing to give clear feedback as well. And so I know this can be so hard sometimes. And as someone who currently, teaches and has various students, and we do speeches and things like that, sometimes that feedback can be hard to hear, right? And so it's really important just to know that that feedback can be worthy, and it can lead to more possibilities and more faithful work and conversations. And so whether that's feedback about communication styles or being able to just recognize how to give that feedback can be really influential in the future. And then lastly, for yourself is recognizing your own confidence and your work and your expertise. And so knowing that you are capable, right? And you have put in the work, you have put in the time, and you know what you're doing. And so just recognizing that in yourself, that you are confident, you are capable, and to really showcase that in other, future conversations or with other people as well. And that you're amazing at what you do. And it can be hard sometimes, right? Because sometimes in certain conversations or conflict, you may not feel that way. But continue to recognize that you have your own experience, you have what that is, recognizing what it is, but also articulating that that is your strength, that is your work, that is your expertise. So these are just some things to continue to think about, of recognizing those communication characteristics in yourself and to really further implement those before you are able to move on to other aspects. And so one activity that I think that could really help this is the Clifton Strengths Finder test. And so I've taken this a couple different times. I have an example, a couple different examples of what those are if you take the test. But I think just taking any type of Strengths Finder test and realizing what those strengths are can be super helpful. And then from there, you can integrate those more into conversations or problem-solving elements in your life. And then potentially after you take that test, maybe make a list of how you want to continue to increase your communication and your confidence abilities with all of those strengths. And then after that, potentially you could make another list, right, of where you have seen successes in those communication and how you want to further implement those in your own farm or business or workplace, whatever it might be. And so knowing what those strengths are and what you are good at, continuing to further implement those in your conversations, but also just in your recognition of what you are capable of doing. And so I think this is a really helpful activity, whether it's this specific one. I've included a link down here to get to the Clifton Strengths, just going to gallup.com and then Clifton Strengths. It does, cost a little bit of money unless you're doing it within the U of M extension or some other organization. But I think that paying for that is worth it, right? To really gain that knowledge for yourself, but also to impact other people as well. So that's one activity, right? You could do to further those communication characteristics and those conflicts you might see in yourself. So the next one I wanted to talk about is communication with spouses and significant others. And so this can be, really trying, because for some of you, you're both living with your significant other spouse and working. And so that can get complicated sometimes. And so looking at some of those tips and things like that as well. I do recognize that not everyone, has a significant other or a spouse. And I think this can still be helpful for you, right? To impact other people, your friends, other family members, but even future things down the line, right? And just kind of knowing that even if you're working in different entities as well. And so some of those tips I wanted to talk about is first, practicing active listening. And I tell my students this as well, as this can be easier said than done, right? You're like, well, of course, I am a great active listener, but maybe going back into those things of, well, what exactly are you doing in that moment? Active listening includes like recognizing your own body language, right? Are you, fully facing them? Are you fully present in that moment? Part of that is confirming what they said, and showing them that you care. And so that you are, truly listening. Some of it might be, eye contact or those types of things. Maybe there's external environment things that may impact those active listening moments. If you are, doing chores and, something goes wrong, maybe that's not the time for a certain conversation. Or if thinking about just any of those external factors that might take place that might mitigate that active listening component. And so just thinking about those things of, are we, you and your spouse, utilizing those active listening elements, and how can you continue to improve upon those things? Another thing is taking the time to go over what your goals are and planning ahead those goals. And so as I've learned in a lot of different grad classes and teams I've worked on and interpersonal relationships, if you aren't knowledgeable about what your goals are, then how will you know what to accomplish or what to solve or where you are at? And so if you never talk about those goals, then it gets really hard to kind of go back to, well, this is what we want to, accomplish, or this is what we want to achieve. And so really thinking about what those goals are ahead of time for you, maybe as a couple, maybe for your business, for your farm, whatever it might be, really talking about what those goals are. It will give you a clear path and a clear mind as well. And so it puts you on the same page, right? And so making sure that you are utilizing that, maybe you are planning ahead, whatever that might look like, and just really engaging in that aspect of making sure that you're on the same page, you're finding that common ground, whatever it might be. The next thing is recognizing that you can't fix everything, or they might not even listen as you're going through a conflict with your spouse or something like that, and that can be so hard. And so knowing that it's sometimes just so difficult, right, to have some of those very serious conversations, but knowing to try your best in that situation, and that's all you could have done, right? Knowing that you can only control, what you can control. You can only control yourself. And so you can't control somebody else. And so thinking about in those moments of trying your best in that situation to, have that conversation, to, problem solve, whatever it might be, and thinking about that if you can't, fix it, it's okay. And then maybe from there, maybe you have to get, others involved or look at it from another angle, whatever it might be, right? And so thinking about sometimes you don't have to fix everything or to solve everything in that moment. And then lastly, I think focusing on the situation, focusing on the solution and not necessarily what caused the problem or how the problem came about. This kind of goes back to goals as well. So thinking about if you're focusing on the solution, right, or where you will get to, or how will you both move forward, that's going to be a lot healthier and easier to do focus on that than what's the problem or why is this problem a thing, those types of things. So if you think about the solution, what will work best, create room for growth and transparency, that will lead to a lot more, success and for you and your spouse, but also just realizing that sometimes it's not always about the problem, right? And thinking about that solution can be really helpful as well. And so there's probably a lot more other elements to this as well, right? But just thinking about that, if you are, finding that common ground, if you are thinking about reaffirming what they said and that you care for them and that you want to make this work, I think that'll really go a long way. And so this activity that I have here, and you can kind of do this wherever, but this is just an example, right, of what you could do to further implement these tips and communication aspects I talked about. And so one is first, set aside time, right? Set aside time to meet with your spouse or significant other in order to meet to do this activity. But in any activity, right? If you're like, oh, we're going to multitask or do it over here, or we've are moving cattle for some reason, or whatever it might be, maybe that might not be the best time to do that activity, right? Or to do that reflection piece. And so set aside specific time to meet with your spouse. And then first is coming up with a few questions or prompts for you and your spouse to discuss. And so maybe you're wanting to frame those around some communication areas you both want to work on. And so maybe if it's something about, the active listening piece, maybe it's about if you're in that moment and you want to, solve the problem, or you just want them to listen, whatever it might be, right? And after that, talk about ways you both want to work on those improvements. And with this, you want to be specific, right? So give specific timelines and approaches of how you will continue to solve that and work on it and grow in those areas. And then additionally, I really like this one, is write down one thing that is bothering you or bothering them. And so write it as like an I feel statement. And so maybe you would write, I feel that you aren't fully present when we are having a serious conversation, or when we are trying to solve this issue, whatever it might be. Or I feel that you jump into things too fast when we're trying to solve this, whatever it might be. And write those I feel statements, and then kind of talk to each other, right? Of why you both feel that way, and maybe some ways to overcome that, and to ways to kind of grow in those communication struggles that you may have. Overall, the biggest thing is really just to validate each other and tell them that you hear them, but you want to hear them too. And that can be so powerful. And so just thinking about those different elements, right? Of continuing to validate them, reaffirm what they said, and that you're obviously here for them, but also want to, grow in those areas and see those improvements as well. So I think those can be very valuable as well. And so lastly, I wanted to talk about is communication with other family members and other, generationally, and what this could look like. I know Suzanne touched on it a little bit with her content. I just want to give you a few more tips and what that would look like. And for some of this, right, we can't necessarily solve everything, right? But I wanted to give you these tips to be helpful for you. And so one is just, thinking about overall how to navigate, right, some of these things. And one, if you're having these conflict or communication struggles with other family members, my first tip for you is, well, one, are you creating a space that makes them comfortable to talk? And so, for example, maybe you're going to a more neutral place to have that conversation. Maybe there's a third party present because there's some animosity, whatever it might be. So creating that neutral space will really help that conversation and that communication aspect. And so if all of you work on the same farm or the same business, maybe don't have that meeting or that conversation on the farm or on site, whatever it might be, right? So thinking about that neutral space can be really helpful, because then nobody's feeling threatened, but also then it leads to more calming environment. The next thing is that I know it can be so hard to stay calm in some situations, but that calmness can be key. And part of this too is that, breathing and taking time to think. And so sometimes I think with part of this is that some of these conversations you might have with family members or situations can be really difficult, right? And so thinking about how to be calm in those situations, maybe you have to walk away and come back. Maybe you have to talk to somebody else about the situation. I'll talk about here in a second an example, but breathing exercises can be super helpful in instances like this. An example could be, say that you and a family member are out fixing some piece of equipment, and say if it's, like me and my dad, or me and my spouse's dad, whatever it might be, and they are really irritated at this piece of tractor that is just not working, right? And, kind of maybe swearing up a storm, whatever terms they might be using, right? And in that moment, they are very frustrated, right? And okay, how are you supposed to communicate, or how are you supposed to help them? Maybe show them that breathing exercise, right? Or how to stay calm in those situations could help those communication issues as well. Another thing I wanted to mention is just acknowledging that your work and expertise are just as important as theirs. And so we come from a lot of different backgrounds. And so for me personally, I didn't grow up on a farm, but my mom did. My grandparents farmed. I've been involved in FFA and those types of things, but also I've done the work in college. I've been involved. I've made that work possible. So my expertise is important. It's just in a different light or in a different area that somebody else's might be. And so acknowledging that mine is important, but also is that other family members. And so utilizing that to the best of your ability. Maybe starting conversations that you have knowledge in this area and have it in specific, and they might have it in a different area. So working together to make each other stronger can be really impactful. Another example could be with this is, say if down the line, once if I get married, that if my future spouse and they farm, that daughter-in-law, father-in-law kind of mixture of thinking about, okay, I know he has expertise in one area and I have expertise in another. And we might butt heads at times, but knowing that, their work is important and so is mine, can really help those conflicts and those conversations with other family members. And I think this could be related to other people as well, right? You might have had those similar experiences where you have your knowledge and expertise in one area and so do they. And so sometimes you don't mesh. So really thinking about acknowledging that at the beginning, I think could be really, really helpful. And then lastly, we're all just showing them that you have a right to the conversation, and so do they. And so thinking about that, you both put in so much work and time and effort, and you want everything to be successful, right? And so what all of you bring to the table is so meaningful, and the entire family can be, shown that, and being, something that can help with that is being upfront about those issues and communications. Overall, all of that can lead to better, future conflict resolutions. And showing that, and so overall showing that you have a right to that conversation, and so do they. And from going from there, just overall thinking about that, family is important, right? And working and living with your family members can be extremely difficult, right? Just because how do you keep those boundaries? How do you keep those lines? But overall, just knowing that you all have a voice and have a say can be really, really impactful as well. And so some activities that I wanted to talk about here could be some potential ones, right? For those conflicts or communication issues you might have with your family members. And so I talked about this a little bit, but the breathing exercise. I do this with my students when it comes to public speaking anxiety, or just anxiety in general, or just like a calmness aspect. And so the 4-4 breathing, box exercise, whatever you call it. There's instructions here, but it's basic. It's pretty simple. Just to breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4, and then repeat for 4 times, not 4 seconds on there. And so that can be a really helpful tool, right? Maybe for yourself or even for other family members, right? Of maybe, again, back to that tractor example, maybe you need to pull them aside and say like, hey, let's come back to this, right? This issue, this equipment malfunction, and just take time to breathe here. Maybe if you are even having, conflict with, your spouse or your sibling, those types of things, maybe you need to take a second, step back and do that breathing exercise, whatever that looks like for you. Another one I've come up with as well is a gratitude jar. And so to further, understand and appreciate the work that your family's doing and that you're doing, is maybe doing a gratitude jar. And so maybe providing your family with, prompts for the week. And so examples could be, what are you thankful for? Personal achievements by your family members, overall appreciation, successes, something you thought they did well, or just something that you're overall just so appreciative by. And I would put this in kind of like a median area, right, of maybe in the kitchen, somewhere where everybody can access it, right? And so thinking about, I think sometimes that can be really helpful too, is just recognizing that you are grateful for what they're doing and who they are, and sometimes that can go a long way as well. So some final takeaways, overall with some of the tips I talked about, sometimes this will work for some of you, sometimes it won't, right? But just recognizing that, communication and conflict with family members can be hard, but just acknowledging where they're coming from and bringing up your stance can be so important. Overall, try to look at those different ways, right? And your strengths, taking the initiative to grow in other areas and to recognize, what your strengths are and what you're continuing to grow and improve upon. And then also just giving other people the space, right? Other family members, spouses, whoever it may be, to grow in their own communication skills and tactics. Again, I talked about, active listening or feedback, whatever it might be, right? Taking the time to recognize that and to work on that can be huge. And so overall, right, these communication struggles, they're going to happen, right? And so taking the time and effort to recognize that and to look forward to future aspects can be so important. And overall, this can really make a difference, right? Within your family, within your interpersonal communication, your conversations, your relationships, but also how your business and your farm operate, and how that can be even more successful if you recognize these communication tactics. And so that's pretty much what I had for today. We're gonna jump into the Q&A now for both me and Suzanne. And so you should be able to type in the Q&A, and then if you want the question to be either allocated towards myself or Suzanne, you can say both or one or the other, whatever works for you. So Suzanne, if you have anything else.
Sounds good. Thank you, Eliza, for proposing this webinar and for just diving into this topic because it's an important one. Communication is, we do this all day, whether we're even talking, like you said, or our nonverbals as well. So that's really an important piece. While people are thinking about if they have some questions that they want to address with us or specific instances that they want to talk about, I just wanted to highlight that we do have a program. It's a national program called Annie's Project. Annie's Project is a 6-week class that can either be in person or we do have a virtual offering in Minnesota as well. One of the 6 sessions, well, I should say all of the sessions focus on the business side of farming and all the different risks that you might need to think about. You know, production risk, legal risk, human resources topics, business pieces. So one of the sessions is focused on communications and this human resources type topic. So we do go through and take the StrengthsFinder assessment, and then we dive into it and talk about what that means for each person. So I just wanted you to know that, Eliza, too, that that's something that we have available, and I'll put the link in the chat so that people can go directly over to that.